Welcome back to Cozy Cosmic Tales, where the silence of the night sky hides stories stranger than fiction. Tonight, we revisit one of the earliest and most unsettling abduction accounts ever recorded, the case of Brazilian farmer Antônio Vilas-Boas, whose routine night of work in 1957 turned into an encounter that changed the course of UFO history. As you listen, settle in, keep your mind open, and let the details unfold slowly, piece by piece, like fragments from a forgotten archive. If you enjoy exploring these rare and haunting cases, make sure to subscribe to Cozy Cosmic Tales, tap the notification bell, and join us every week for another journey through the unexplained. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this was delusion, projection, or a genuine event? Let's begin. October of 94 settled heavily over the countryside of Minas Gerais, Brazil. The air carried a dry chill, unusual for the season, and the nights stretched long over fields that depended on human endurance more than machinery. In this rural stretch, a young farmer, Antônio Vilas-Boas, worked alone under the dim light of the moon. He was 23 years old, accustomed to solitude, and defined by labor rather than leisure. His life revolved around tilling the earth, tending to crops, and maintaining the modest family land. There were no distractions, no modern entertainments. The rhythm of survival was measured in hours worked, soil turned, and yields collected. Antonio was not a man of books or higher education. He had not been exposed to scientific journals, nor to the expanding discussions of space exploration or speculative science that circulated in the cities. The concept of flying saucers, already popularized in newspapers abroad, had little meaning here. For him, there was no theoretical framework for extraordinary phenomena. There was only the land, the machinery he operated, and the responsibility of farming in a region where economic margins were thin and every harvest mattered. His work habits were practical, but punishing. The heat of the Brazilian sun forced him into nocturnal routines, plowing the fields at night when temperatures allowed machines and men to move more freely. The sound of his tractor often became the only noise in the stillness of the countryside. Beyond its engine, silence pressed down across the vast, empty space. Isolation framed every part of his existence. He lived not far from his family, but much of his work demanded solitary hours. Conversations with neighbors were infrequent. Nights were long and uneventful. There was no suggestion that anything unusual ever pierced the monotony. The psychological weight of this routine was subtle. Hours of repetition, punctuated only by the faint hum of insects and the turning of soil. On this particular evening in mid-October, the environment carried a sharper edge of quiet than usual. Clouds veiled the stars intermittently, leaving the fields below in alternating shades of dim visibility and sudden darkness. Antonio's focus was fixed on his plowing, straight lines across earth that stretched endlessly, with no audience to observe the labor. It was a scene devoid of drama, almost mechanical in its predictability. The countryside itself could induce a sense of unease for anyone unaccustomed to it. At night, the flatness of the fields met the emptiness of the sky, creating an environment where distance blurred. What was near and what was far seemed indistinguishable. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and every sound carried farther than expected. But for Antonio, this was ordinary. He did not interpret the silence as threatening. It was simply the background against which his life played out. The tractor roared and quieted in rhythm with his adjustments. The soil yielded predictably. His hands, blistered from years of labor, moved with practiced certainty over the controls. Yet, beneath this mechanical reliability, there was a peculiar stillness in the air that he later remembered. Not dramatic, not sudden, but notable enough to remain etched in memory. His routines created the impression that nights would always remain predictable, that fields would always meet horizon, that silence would always dominate the land. And yet, this same setting, the darkness, the machinery, the fatigue of long work, would soon become the stage for one of the most controversial and dissected accounts in UFO history. For now, Antonio worked with the same focus as every night before. Nothing about his actions suggested the anticipation of interruption. The countryside, as always, provided only quiet at witness. But the night was not finished. Its silence carried weight, pressing down as though waiting. That night, the silence of the fields didn't stay silent for long. The night unfolded as it had many times before. The mechanical rhythm of the tractor, the smell of turned soil, and the expansive silence of the Minas Gerais countryside. Antônio Vilas-Boas kept his focus on the field, guiding the plow under dim light. It was past midnight when the ordinary rhythm shifted. At first, it was only a subtle glow, faint, red, and misplaced against the night sky. His initial assumption was practical. Light sometimes marked the presence of distant vehicles, or the navigation lamps of aircraft crossing rural airspace. Both explanations were plausible, and neither carried weight enough to disturb his concentration. He noted the glow, then returned his attention to the work. Minutes passed, and the light did not fade. Instead, it grew more distinct. Against the still horizon, the glow separated itself from any ground source, hanging at an elevation that challenged his initial assumptions. It was neither close to the earth, like a tractor lamp, nor positioned with the steady, linear movement of an aircraft. Instead, it hovered, an unnatural pause in motion, before darting several lengths to one side and halting again. Antonio paused his work to observe. The silence around him sharpened. The tractor engine idled roughly, its vibration a reminder of the ordinary, while the light's movements contradicted it. He described the glow as a bright red sphere, oscillating without sound. Its movements were abrupt. First still, then sudden shifts across the sky, at angles no conventional machine would follow. Each pause was precise, as though balanced on an invisible axis. For a man unaccustomed to speculation, his attention remained fixed on what was measurable: the color, the speed, the silence. The light did not hum, buzz, or echo. No sound accompanied its acceleration or its abrupt stops. The absence of noise, paired with the erratic patterns, created an nice he would later struggle to describe. In an environment where distance was usually clear, field below, sky above, the object disrupted all sense of placement. He tried once more to reason with the scene. Aircraft he considered again, but aircraft followed predictable lines, with engines audible even at distance. Ground vehicles, perhaps. Yet no road or track passed where the light lingered, and the glow's altitude negated that explanation. With each passing minute, the logic of the ordinary collapsed, leaving only the presence of an object that did not fit his world. The tractor's engine stuttered in idle, as though competing for his attention. He leaned against it, eyes fixed on the moving glow. The air felt heavier, though the night remained cool. Time extended, each movement of the red light marking another failure to reconcile what he saw with what he knew. Eventually, the glow retreated, drifting across the horizon until distance consumed it. The silence of the countryside closed in again. Antonio returned to his work, but not without a shift in awareness. The fields no longer felt secure in their emptiness. The night no longer promised predictability. A pattern of routine had been broken, and he carried the weight of it back into his labor. The following day passed without incident, but memory of the light persisted. He recalled its hovering stillness, its abrupt accelerations, and the complete absence of noise. The more he thought of it, the more it stood apart from anything mechanical or natural he had known. He did not share the event widely. His work demanded his attention, and explanation seemed beyond reach, but the night would not release him. Within days, the red glow returned. Again it hovered, shifted, and darted without sound. This time it lingered longer, as if testing his endurance, as if waiting to be noticed again. When the glow returned the following nights, it became impossible to dismiss as ordinary. The second return of the red light came without warning. The night was clear, the fields dry, and Antônio Vilas-Boas worked his tractor with the same mechanical focus as always. The routine was uninterrupted until the glow appeared again, brighter than before, lowering itself into proximity that demanded attention. The first indicator of change was not visual, but mechanical. The tractor, which had been operating without difficulty, faltered. Its steady rhythm broke into uneven sputters. Antonio adjusted the throttle, applied pressure to the controls, and attempted to regulate its pace. For several seconds, the machine resisted his corrections, then failed altogether. The engine cut to silence. The sudden absence of mechanical noise amplified the stillness of the countryside, where once the hum of gears and pistons filled the air. Now there was only silence and the hovering presence of the red glow. Antonio tried the ignition again. He pressed, pulled, and manipulated the controls with the force of routine habit. The response was null. The starter turned. The levers clicked into place, but combustion refused to resume. He repeated the process multiple times. Each attempt carried the same result. No spark, no ignition, no return of power. His hands grew tighter on the controls, his movements quicker, but the machine remained inert. The stalling was complete, without fluctuation, as though the entire system had been disabled simultaneously. During these moments of mechanical failure, the red light advanced closer. Hovering low above the field, it maintained its silence, a vivid contrast to the dead machinery. Antonio observed it directly, its motion now less erratic than before, as if anchored deliberately above his land. The glow cast shadows against the soil, stretching uneven lines across the plowed rows. Its presence was no longer peripheral. It was central. He once climbed hooks, edged down briefly to inspect the tractor, checking components he could reach in the dark. The fuel line remained intact. No leaks, no obstructions. He attempted once more to start the engine, forcing the ignition until strain marked the effort. Nothing responded. Each attempt ended in silence, the machine inert. The psychological weight built not from imagination, but from detail. The craft above continued to hover, its movements precise, controlled, and unaffected by wind or terrain. The tractor, a machine Antonio relied on daily, had been rendered useless in its presence. This cause and effect relationship, though unspoken, was unmistakable. Antonio's frustration mounted. His labor had been interrupted, his equipment disabled, and the isolation of the farmland offered no immediate help. He sat for a moment on the tractor seat, hands resting against silent controls, eyes fixed on the light above. His breathing quickened. The ordinary predictability of his world. Machines functioning, work proceeding, nights passing, was gone. The silence pressed harder. Without the engine's hum, every sound in the environment should have been audible, but there was nothing. No wind, no animals, no distant voices. Only the glow remained, suspended, deliberate. He tried one final time to force the engine into life. He pushed the ignition, held it, and listened for the turnover. Instead, the machine responded with the same dead refusal. The stalling was absolute. His tractor, a symbol of work and control, was useless under the weight of the red glow. The object did not retreat. It hovered as if watching, as if placing itself deliberately within reach. Antonio stayed seated, frozen in place, waiting for change, his focus shifting from controls to sky. His fear was not expressed in words or panic, but in stillness, the quiet acknowledgement that the environment no longer obeyed ordinary rules. This was no longer just a light in the distance. It was on his land. The red glow no longer remained at distance. After the tractor's failure, Antônio Vilas-Boas watched as the object lowered itself gradually from its position in the sky. What had first appeared as an indistinct light revealed form and structure in its descent. The craft was metallic in appearance, reflecting fragments of the moonlight that managed to cut through the clouds. Its surface appeared polished, smooth, and without seams. The body of the object carried the shape of an elongated egg, broad at the center and tapering at the ends. Antonio estimated its scale against the farmhouse he knew so well. It appeared comparable in size to a small house, large enough to occupy a significant portion of the plowed field. As it neared the ground, additional detail became visible. A dome, situated at the top of the craft, rotated steadily. From within this dome, light radiated outward in pulses, a bright, shifting illumination that moved in steady intervals. The dome's rotation was mechanical, methodical, unhurried, as if fixed to a cycle independent of the descent. The landing was precise. 4 metallic legs extended from the underside of the structure, evenly spaced to distribute weight. They locked into place with visible motion before the craft touched the soil. The descent carried no audible force, no roar of engines, no rush of air, no vibration through the ground. Instead, the field remained silent, as if sound itself had been removed from the environment. When the legs reached the earth, the impact was minimal. The machine balanced itself evenly, like equipment set gently into place. Antonio remained at his stalled tractor, positioned only meters away from where the craft settled. He noted the absence of any exhaust, flame, or visible propulsion system. The air did not ripple or distort, and the soil remained unaffected beyond the pressure points of the landing struts. In place of conventional mechanics, there was only the stark metallic form and its silent dominance of the field. For several seconds, the object remained motionless. The dome continued to rotate, casting light in sweeping arcs across the rows of tilled earth. Antonio's hands rested it against the dead controls of his machine, though the gesture was more instinctive than purposeful. His eyes remained fixed on the structure before him. Then, movement registered. A section of the craft opened, forming an aperture along one side. The door, if it could be called that, lowered slowly, creating a ramp that extended toward the soil. The mechanics of the motion were deliberate, controlled, and entirely silent. Inside the opening, light spilled outward. It was not blinding, but steady, illuminating the ramp and the surrounding ground. The source of this illumination was not visible, diffused from within as though the walls themselves carried brightness. From the opening, shapes emerged. Small in stature, their outlines were defined first against the spill of light, then clarified as they stepped fully into view. Their forms were covered in tight-fitting suits, smooth and uniform, with helmets enclosing their heads. They walked with coordination, descending the ramp in measured steps. Antonio's body remained still, yet his perception sharpened. The details imprinted themselves with clarity. The polished metallic structure, the rotating dome, the house-sized bulk of the craft, the 4 metallic legs pressed into his farmland, and now, figures moving with intention toward him. The ordinary world of soil, crop lines, and machines was gone. In its place stood an engineered object of unknown origin, positioned deliberately in the isolation of his land. From its hatch, small suited figures began walking toward him. The figures advanced in measured steps, their movements coordinated and deliberate. They appeared smaller than average adult humans, though still proportionate in form. Their bodies were encased in tight-fitting suits, seamless from neck to boots, the material reflecting light faintly. Each head was enclosed by a rounded helmet, smooth and opaque, concealing any facial detail. No insignia, tools, or visible weapons marked their uniforms. As they approached, Antônio Vilas-Boas remained seated on the tractor for several moments, uncertain whether to remain still or retreat. His hesitation ended when 2 of the suited figures broke from formation and moved directly toward him. Their pace quickened. Instinctively, he climbed down from the machine and attempted to step backward into the field. The first contact was sudden. One of the figures reached him with arms extended, gripping firmly around his elbow. The strength applied was disproportionate to the smaller size of the being. Antonio pulled away, forcing his weight in the opposite direction, but the second figure closed in quickly, securing his other arm. The grip was mechanical in its steadiness, unwavering, consistent, and difficult to break. He twisted and attempted to wrench free, using his body weight to resist. The soil beneath his boots gave way, offering little traction. He managed to pull one arm loose briefly, only for it to be seized again. His attempts at vocal protest, shouting into the empty night, met no response. The figures did not communicate. They moved with a singular purpose: containment. A third figure joined the restraint, gripping his shoulders from behind. The combined pressure forced Antonio forward, his balance broken, his body dragged toward the open hatch of the craft. The helmets of the beings reflected the rotating dome light above, featureless, without indication of eyes or expression. The ear silence deepened the procedural quality of the encounter. No weapons were drawn. No strikes were delivered. The method of control relied solely on physical overpowering. Antonio's resistance, forceful kicks, attempts to plant his feet, and jerking motions were ineffective. Each effort was absorbed and countered by steady collective strength. His body, though taller than theirs, was reduced to compliance through numbers and grip. The sensation of restraint carried a precision unlike ordinary human grappling. There was no chaos in their movements. Each hand that closed on him remained fixed, pressure applied evenly, without tremor or hesitation. Antonio's struggles diminished gradually, not from willingness, but from futility. The beings adapted to each shift of his body, tightening where necessary, repositioning when he twisted, never loosening entirely. Dragged across the soil, he felt the incline of the ramp beneath his feet. The surface was metallic, smooth, colder than the earth he had left behind. His boots scraped against it as they pulled him upward, his arms locked in their grip. The field fell away behind him, replaced by the structured brightness of the craft's interior. At the threshold, he braced again, forcing his pony into resistance, widening his stance to block entry. For a moment, the pull ceased. Then additional figures approached, assisting in the process. Their combined effort shifted him forward, inch by inch, into the illuminated corridor beyond. The silence remained absolute. No voice, no command, no signal between the figures marked their cooperation. The operation unfolded with the efficiency of a practiced maneuver. Antonio's awareness shifted in that moment. The light in the sky was no longer distant, the craft no longer an object to observe. The control exerted on his body marked a transition. This was not a sighting to describe later. It was as an event being imposed on him directly. For the first time he realized this was not just sighting, but capture. The ramp rose beneath Antônio Vilas-Boas as the figures pulled him steadily forward. His boots scraped against the smooth surface, producing the only sound audible in the moment. Beyond the entrance, the light intensified, but not in the way of a visible lamp or bulb. The illumination seemed to radiate uniformly from the walls themselves, casting no shadows and leaving no corner unlit. It was brightness without a source. Crossing the threshold, he found himself in a narrow corridor, metallic and sterile. The walls were seamless, curved slightly inward, their surfaces polished, but without rivets or joints. No markings, switches, or visible mechanisms broke the uniformity. The air was dense, carrying no scent of soil, fuel, or machinery, only a neutrality that felt manufactured. The silence deepened. His captor's movements produced no echo, no resonance against the metallic walls. The sound of his own breathing grew disproportionate, each inhale and exhale magnified in the absence of external noise. Even the drag of boots across the floor produced a muffled effect, as though the material absorbed sound. He was guided forward, the figures holding his arms at fixed angles. The corridor extended ahead, featureless, bending slightly in its trajectory. At intervals, branching passageways opened briefly before closing again behind sliding panels. Their motion was smooth, noiseless, and automatic. The architecture offered no clue of function or design, only uniform, sterile passage. The light did not fluctuate, no matter how far they advanced. Unlike the lamps or lanterns, Antonio knew, these surfaces did not cast gradients or shadows. His captors passed through without pause, navigating turns with precision, as though following a memorized route. After several minutes, the group entered a larger chamber. The transition was abrupt. the corridor opened into a room expansive enough to accommodate both the figures and the restrained man without crowding. The walls here mirrored the same metallic polish, but carried a distinct difference. The brightness intensified, producing a clinical atmosphere comparable to a medical ward. The floor was smooth and reflective, curving slightly into the walls as though designed without edges. Around the perimeter, Antonio noted the presence of objects resembling instruments or devices, though their structure bore little resemblance to the tools of agriculture or medicine familiar to him. Cylindrical stands, narrow metallic arms, and raised platforms occupied positions against the walls. None bore buttons, dials, or recognizable components. Their purpose remained undefined. At the center of the room stood a rectangular, table-like structure, metallic and unadorned, elevated slightly above the floor. It lacked bedding, straps, or coverings, yet its placement suggested deliberate use. The figures guided Antonio toward it, their grip unyielding. As they reached the center, the silence pressed heavier. The room carried no hum of machinery, no indication of ventilation, no audible operation of lights. Its brightness, combined with its stillness, created a suffocating impression, an environment devoid of the imperfections and irregularities of natural space. Antonio was positioned near the metallic platform. His captors adjusted their grip, rotating him toward it with coordinated movement. They released him only briefly, then repositioned to block escape routes. Their silence continued, as steady as their control. For several moments, nothing occurred. He stood in the brightness of the chamber, surrounded by suited figures, his gaze moving across polished walls and incomprehensible instruments. The sterile atmosphere carried a weight more oppressive than the physical restraint. It was clear the chamber existed for a singular purpose. Its structure, its brightness, and its central platform all suggested a procedural function. Then they began the procedures. Inside the chamber, Antônio Vilas-Boas was maneuvered toward the central platform. The figures adjusted his position with coordinated movements, guiding him onto its metallic surface. The platform was cold and rigid, with no padding to soften its texture. Once placed there, his arms and legs were held firmly by the suited beings. Though no mechanical restraints were applied, their grip alone was sufficient to immobilize him. The first step of the procedure involved the removal of his clothing. His garments were pulled away in layers, folded aside without hesitation or regard for comfort. The process was efficient and silent. Antonio resisted briefly, but the effort was absorbed and countered with the same mechanical steadiness as before. Within minutes, he was stripped completely, exposed under the chamber's unwavering brightness. Once unclothed, a gel-like substance was applied across his body. The material was semi-transparent, viscous, and spread with deliberate strokes by the figure's gloved hands. It carried no discernible scent. The texture was unpleasant, slippery, cold, and coating every surface of his skin. The gel adhered uniformly, creating a thin film that reflected the chamber's artificial light. No explanation accompanied its application, and no attempt at communication was made. Following this, one of the beings produced an instrument. Its structure did not resemble a syringe or blade, as Antonio understood them. It appeared metallic, narrow, and designed with a precision that lacked visible mechanisms. The figure moved to his head, tilting it slightly to expose the lower portion of his jaw. The point of the instrument pressed against his chin. A sharp incision followed, quick and exact, Antonio described the sensation as cold pain, immediate and localized, spreading outward briefly before dulling. The instrument was then used to extract blood directly from the wound. He observed a small quantity drawn, collected into the device through an unseen mechanism. The process carried no sound, no suction, no mechanical click, only the sterile silence of the chamber. Afterward, the wound was left untreated. The incision remained visible. Blood clotted faintly against the layer of gel covering his skin. No attempt was made to dress or close it. The figure placed the instrument aside, returning it to a surface along the perimeter. Throughout the procedure, Antonio's discomfort was clear but ineffective as resistance. His body shifted under their hands. His muscles tensed. His breathing grew rapid, yet each effort to pull away was absorbed and neutralized by the same unwavering grips. The figures worked with detachment, unaffected by his movements, as though his body were an object for examination rather than a subject in distress. The atmosphere of the chamber magnified his helplessness. The absence of sound reduced every detail to the tactile and the visual. The gel's cold slickness, the incision's sharp sting, the sterile brightness, all became the markers of the event. The figures themselves remained unresponsive, neither aggressive nor sympathetic, only procedural. When the initial phase concluded, Antonio was left momentarily untouched. His body remained coated in the gel, his chin marked with a wound, his breathing heavy against the oppressive silence. The figures stepped back only slightly, repositioning as though preparing for subsequent steps. The instruments remained in place around the perimeter, their functions undefined but present, each one a potential continuation. The pause offered no relief. It carried the weight of transition, the certainty that the process had not yet concluded, and the procedures weren't over. When the initial procedures ended, Antônio Vilas-Boas was released from direct restraint. The suited figures stepped back, repositioned briefly, and then guided him off the platform. He was directed toward a smaller adjoining room, separated from the central chamber by a seamless sliding panel. The transition was wordless and precise. The panel closed immediately behind him, sealing without visible handle or lock. The room itself was bare and uniform. The walls curved gently into floor and ceiling, metallic and smooth, without seams. Like the chamber before, the light had no visible source, radiating evenly across every surface. There were no furnishings, no instruments, no objects of any kind. Only space, enclosed, bright, and silent. In that confinement, time began to distort. Antonio later described the duration as hours, though without any natural markers. No sun, no shifting of light, no sound to measure intervals. His perception remained imprecise. The silence created an oppressive weight. His own breathing became the only audible presence. Every inhale and exhale echoed faintly in the brightness, a reminder of solitude rather than company. There was no communication, verbal or otherwise. No figure entered. No signal was given. He was left without explanation of what had occurred or what would follow. The absence of interaction carried a deliberate quality, as though his isolation were itself a stage in the process. Psychological strain emerged through details. He alternated between standing and sitting on the smooth floor, but neither position provided relief. The gel substance still coated his body, its cold film clinging to his skin, amplifying his sense of exposure. The incision on his chin throbbed intermittently, a reminder of the procedure, but not severe enough to dominate his awareness. What weighed more heavily was the uncertainty, the absence of any indicator of purpose or outcome. The silence became a pressure. In ordinary life, even rural nights carried sound. Insects, wind, distant dogs. Here, there was none. He attempted to listen for movement beyond the walls, but nothing penetrated. The structure absorbed all noise, reducing his existence to stillness within a sealed container. He attempted to rest, but found no comfort. The brightness was unrelenting, preventing the closing of eyes from creating darkness. With no shadows, depth itself seemed absent. Every direction looked the same. His sense of orientation weakened, making it unclear whether minutes or hours passed between each movement. Fear and confusion intertwined, but remained suppressed under the stark detachment of the environment. He had no means to act. His body was intact, his will present, but no path existed for escape. The room contained him not with locks or guards, but with its featureless completeness. Every attempt to press against the walls or search for an opening ended in the same result: smooth, metallic resistance. The isolation carried a procedural character, as though designed to measure endurance, but endurance of what was unclear, whether physical, psychological, or both. Antonio's helplessness grew not from violence, but from absence. Nothing occurred. Nothing changed. The absence itself became the experiment. He lost track of his posture, shifting at intervals without recognition of how long he had remained still. His body grew fatigued, though no labor had been demanded. The weight came from the stillness, the inescapable brightness, and the silence that rendered each second indistinguishable from the last. Then, without warning, the continuity broke. A panel slid aside, seamless walls parting to reveal the chamber beyond. Light spilled in, though it was no brighter than the room he occupied. A figure entered, not one of the group who had restrained him before, but someone else entirely. But then the door opened again, and someone else entered. The panel opened with the same silent precision as before. From its threshold stepped a figure unlike the ones who had restrained and examined him. This being stood taller than the suited forms, closer to Antonio's own height, with distinctly human proportions. Unlike the earlier figures, she was not encased in a full uniform. Her skin appeared pale, almost luminescent under the chamber's white light. Her hair was long, straight, and platinum blonde, falling evenly past her shoulders. The most prominent feature, however, was her eyes, large, slightly elongated, and blue, their clarity stark against her otherwise expressionless face. She exhibited no signs of age or fatigue. Her movements were deliberate, measured, and without hesitation. Her attire was minimal, not the seamless suit of the earlier beings, but something closer to a fitted garment. It clung tightly to her frame, simple in design, without markings or fastenings. Antonio observed that the clothing left her form more defined, contrasting against the unmarked helmets and featureless uniforms of the others. No words were spoken. The silence that had defined the craft persisted. Communication, if intended, occurred only through gesture and proximity. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed directly on him. Antonio noted that her gaze did not wander, nor did she display hesitation. The focus remained constant, as though directed by intention rather than curiosity. At close range, he distinguished the texture of her skin, smooth, without blemish or imperfection. Her expression remained neutral, neither hostile nor reassuring. When she moved, her motions carried the same efficiency he had seen in the suited beings, precise, controlled, never hurried. The distance between them closed until she stood within an arm's reach. She raised one hand slowly and placed it against his shoulder. The touch was firm, but not forceful, a gesture of position rather than restraint. With her other hand, she motioned downward toward the floor, a simple indication for him to sit or recline. Antonio did not comply at first, uncertain of her intent. In response, she repeated the gesture, more insistent, though still silent. Her communication relied entirely on this nonverbal repetition. No sound, no facial expression, only the clear physical instruction. Her presence contrasted sharply with the earlier figures. While they had seized and dragged him with efficiency, she engaged differently. Her gestures suggested orchestration rather than raw force, a sequence meant to direct rather than restrain. Yet the silence and the clinical atmosphere rendered her actions no less unsettling. Antonio described her physical features as unmistakably strong. Her arms, though slender, displayed firm muscle tone when they moved. Her overall posture carried confidence, upright and balanced, as though every action was intentional. Nothing about her movements suggested randomness. He continued to observe in silence, his perception sharpened by the absence of any verbal exchange. Every detail, the shade of her hair, the clarity of her eyes, the stillness of her face, registered as markers of difference. For several minutes, the exchange remained limited to her gestures and proximity. She moved around him slowly, occasionally touching his arms or shoulders, directing him with small motions of her hands. Each gesture carried clarity, as though rehearsed. The silence magnified the weight of her presence. Without speech, without sound, the interaction became a series of controlled instructions delivered through movement. Antonio followed reluctantly, compelled more by her insistence than by understanding. Then, her gestures shifted. One hand on her own abdomen, pressing lightly to emphasize the area. After holding the gesture, she raised the same hand and pointed upward. The motion was simple, but its meaning carried implications beyond the clinical. Her gestures would turn the situation from medical to something else entirely. The gestures transitioned from direction to initiation. The female figure remained close, her movements controlled and deliberate. Without speaking, she guided Antonio's body toward her, using firm but unhurried motions of her hands. Resistance on his part was met not with forceful restraint, but with persistent redirection, as though his compliance was assumed rather than requested. The interaction progressed with an absence of dialogue. No explanation was offered, no attempt at communication beyond physical motion. The figures who had conducted the earlier procedures were not present. The encounter unfolded in isolation, confined to her and him within the sterile room. Antonio described her behavior as deliberate and unemotional. Each movement appeared structured, part of an orchestrated sequence. She did not display signs of affection or hesitation. Her eyes, fixed and unblinking, maintained contact with his face even as her body pressed closer. Her posture and actions conveyed intention without intimacy. Physical contact intensified. She positioned herself with clarity of purpose, arranging his body against hers with decisive gestures. The interaction carried a clinical quality, as though fulfilling a specific requirement rather than engaging in shared experience. Antonio perceived himself not as participant, but as subject, a body being used within a process. The encounter culminated in intercourse, initiated wholly by her direction. Her control of movement remained steady, and her silence persisted throughout. Antonio noted the absence of vocalization, either of pain or pleasure. The event carried none of the spontaneity or emotion associated with human intimacy. Instead, it unfolded with the precision of a task executed to completion. During the act, she occasionally touched his shoulders or arms, guiding his responses physically rather than relying on verbal instruction. Her actions conveyed focus, not desire. Her face remained expressionless, her eyes locked on his. The atmosphere reinforced the impression of procedure rather than connection. For Antonio, the experience was marked by discomfort and a detachment. He later explained that he felt himself reduced to function, his role limited to biological provision. The act was not framed by mutuality, but by use. He remained aware of the incision on his chin, the gel still coating his skin, and the sterile light that illuminated every detail without shadow. The surrounding environment stripped the encounter of privacy or humanity, leaving only exposure and control. When the act ended, she disengaged without ceremony. Her motions were efficient, withdrawing from him as deliberately as she had initiated. She adjusted her posture, straightened her body, and stepped back. No gesture of reassurance, no acknowledgement, and no attempt at communication accompanied the conclusion. Then she made a single, distinct gesture. Placing one hand firmly on her abdomen, she held it there briefly, pressing as though to emphasize location. After a pause, she raised the same hand and pointed upward, toward the ceiling or beyond it, toward the sky. The motion was simple, unmistakable. She repeated it once, then allowed her arm to fall back to her side. The gesture was the only symbolic action of the encounter, and it carried implications that extended beyond the room. Antonio interpreted it as indication that what had just occurred was not isolated, but part of a larger purpose. The meaning suggested reproduction, continuation elsewhere, outside his reach. She gave no further signal. The silence closed around them once again, and the sterile brightness continued to press against every surface. It was less intimacy and more transaction. For him, the meaning was chilling. His role ended here. After the act concluded, the female figure did not leave the room immediately. She adjusted her posture, stepping back just enough to establish distance, her expression unchanged. For several moments, she remained silent and still, her gaze fixed directly on Antonio. The sterile light illuminated her without variance, highlighting each feature yet offering no shift in mood or meaning. Then, with controlled precision, she performed a sequence of gestures. Raising her right hand, she placed it firmly on her abdomen, holding it there with emphasis. The gesture was deliberate, not casual. She pressed lightly, enough to indicate focus on the area. Her eyes remained on Antonio as the motion continued, ensuring his observation. After a pause, She lifted her hand from her abdomen and extended her arm upward. Her index finger pointed directly toward the ceiling, toward the sky beyond the structure. The movement was slow, unambiguous, and repeated once to reinforce the intent. No sound accompanied the gesture. No additional explanation was offered. The sequence, hand to abdomen, hand to sky, formed the entirety of her communication. Antonio later reported that this was the only indication of meaning he received from her throughout the encounter. She did not smile, did not vocalize, did not alter her expression. The silence that had dominated since her entry continued unbroken. For Antonio, the implication became clear through context. The placement of her ket on her abdomen suggested a reference to fertility or conception. The subsequent motion toward the sky implied relocation or removal, an outcome carried elsewhere, beyond him, outside the environment of the room, and beyond his influence. Together, the gestures conveyed an interpretation that the act they had just performed was not for intimacy, not for shared experience, but for a specific reproductive purpose, whose result would not remain with him. The psychological effect of this realization was significant. Antonio understood himself in that moment as reduced to a role, a provider of biological material, nothing more. The act was not framed by desire, nor by human interaction, but by use. His body had been required for a process, and that process was complete. The gestures confirmed finality. The environment amplified this conclusion. The sterile light offered no comfort. The metallic walls provided no context of home or humanity. The woman's silence and detachment emphasized the separation between action and meaning. Even as she gestured, her face remained expressionless, her eyes sharp and steady. It was communication without connection, instruction without dialogue. Antonio did not respond verbally. There was no language to answer, no way to interrupt. He remained still, his body coated with the gel substance, his chin marked by the earlier incision, his breathing uneven in the silence. The weight of interpretation pressed heavily. He had been used for an outcome, and now that outcome was signaled as beyond him. The woman, having completed the sequence of gestures, stepped back slightly. She did not repeat them again. Instead, she maintained her gaze for several seconds longer, then turned her body slightly away. Her role in the interaction seemingly concluded. No additional gestures followed, no attempt at reassurance, no indication of continued engagement. For Antonio, the message was final. The meaning of her gestures was chilling not because of ambiguity, but because of clarity. He understood them as a conclusion. Whatever followed, his role was finished. When the gestures ended, the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted. The female figure withdrew, stepping toward the same panel through which she had entered. She exited without a word, without repetition of her signals. The panel sealed behind her, seamlessly, returning the room to its sterile uniformity. Moments later, the original suited figures reappeared. Their movements carried the same procedural precision as before, unhurried but deliberate. They approached Antonio, who remained standing under the unyielding white light, his skin still coated with the gel applied during earlier procedures. Without communication, they began the process of redressing him. His clothes, which had been removed systematically earlier, were returned piece by piece. Each garment was placed on him with the same efficiency, pulled, adjusted, fastened, without hesitation. No expression accompanied the action, no suggestion of care or hostility. It was function only. The garments felt unfamiliar against his skin, dampened slightly by the remaining gel. He noted their texture had not changed, but his perception of them had. Once dressed, Antonio was guided by firm grips toward the corridor. The figures held his arms as they had when bringing him inside, their strength steady and unyielding. The silence of the environment persisted. No machinery, no hum of engines, no voices, only the sound of their coordinated footsteps and his own uneven breathing marked the passage through the corridor. The route back was brief, though indistinguishable from the one before. Identical walls, seamless panels, and uniform lighting blurred orientation. There was no way to mark direction or distance. Antonio could only follow the pull of their grip until the corridor opened again onto the descending ramp. Outside, the night remained intact. The fields lay silent under the darkness, the air cool against his skin. He tractor, stalled where he had left it, stood as the only marker of the ordinary. He was escorted down the ramp and released a short distance from the craft. The figures did not linger. They turned and re-entered through the open hatch. The ramp rose slowly, the aperture sealing behind them. For several moments, the craft remained grounded. Its dome continued its steady rotation, casting light in mechanical arcs across the farmland. Then, without noise or visible exhaust, it began to ascend. The four metallic legs retracted smoothly, folding into its body. The entire structure lifted vertically, maintaining stability as though unaffected by gravity or air resistance. The ascent produced no vibration, no wind, no audible disruption of the environment. Antonio observed in silence as the craft gained height. Its illumination faded gradually, shrinking into the sky until only a red speck remained. Within seconds, it vanished into the darkness, leaving the farmland unaltered. The countryside returned to silence. No evidence of the event remained beyond the stalled tractor and the impressions left in Antonio's perception. He stood alone in the field, his clothes damp with gel, his body marked by incision and fatigue. The duration of his captivity, estimated later at 4 hours, weighed on him as absence. Time removed, routine broken. The anticlimax of release did not lessen its gravity. The silence after the departure carried more weight than the procedures themselves. What had entered his land and taken him had left with precision, leaving him to reconcile what could not be reconciled. He remained in the field for several minutes, watching the empty sky, aware that nothing returned. The machinery of his daily life stood useless, the night unaltered, and yet everything had changed. But the encounter didn't end when the lights vanished. In the days following the encounter, Antônio Vilas-Boas attempted to resume his normal routine on the family farm. Yet his body did not respond with its usual reliability. Within hours of returning from the field, he began to develop symptoms inconsistent with his prior health. The first signs were persistent nausea and headaches. These occurred intermittently at first, then increased in frequency. The nausea produced repeated episodes of vomiting, often without food present in the stomach. The headaches were described as sharp, localized, and resistant to rest. Soon after, Additional symptoms emerged. Antonio experienced extreme fatigue, an inability to sustain physical labor for more than brief intervals. Tasks that had previously required little effort now left him exhausted. He struggled to continue field work, resting often. His body weakened without apparent cause. His skin developed lesions resembling burns. Small reddish marks appeared initially on exposed areas, the arms, face, and neck. Over time, they spread, forming patches that produced discomfort and sensitivity. These lesions did not blister like thermal burns, but carried a dry, irritated quality. They worsened when exposed to sunlight, creating acute sensitivity to light that forced him to avoid daytime labor. At night, Antonio noted episodes of dizziness. He described moments of disorientation when moving quickly or bending down. His appetite diminished, and weight loss became evident over several days. His body, once conditioned to the physical demands of rural labor, now appeared unable to sustain even ordinary exertion. The combination of symptoms created an overall clinical picture marked by systemic decline, gastrointestinal distress, neurological complaints, dermatological damage, and generalized fatigue coexisted without improvement. Each day compounded his weakness. Family members observed this changes with concern. They noted his frequent vomiting, his visible lesions, and his avoidance of sunlight. They also described changes in his demeanor, reduced speech, withdrawn behavior, and a preoccupation with the events in the field. Yet Antonio himself spoke little of what had occurred, offering no immediate explanation for the sudden deterioration of his health. The marks on his skin were particularly striking. Their appearance aligned less with physical trauma from machinery or farm labor, and more with burns resembling low-level radiation exposure, a condition not typically encountered in rural Brazil during this period. The lesions neither healed quickly nor worsened into infection. Instead, they persisted in a static state, aggravating under light and easing slightly in darkness. As the days advanced, the persistence of symptoms prevented recovery. His family urged him to seek medical evaluation. Reluctant at first, he grew increasingly aware that his condition was not improving and that his body no longer supported the demands of agricultural work. His physical decline became undeniable, forcing him to acknowledge the necessity of examination. He reported later that the incision on his chin created during the procedures remained tender but secondary compared to the systemic illness that followed. The wound had clotted, but its persistence reinforced the memory of the extraction. Combined with the lesions and fatigue, it suggested that what had occurred inside the craft had lasting physiological consequences. By the end of the week, Antonio resolved to present his symptoms to a physician. The accumulation of nausea, headaches, skin lesions, fatigue, and sensitivity to light demanded professional assessment. A doctor would soon examine him and confirm unusual findings. In 1961, nearly 4 years after the events on his family's farmland, Antônio Vilas-Boas gave a full account of his experience to Dr. Olavo Fontes, a physician affiliated with the National School of Medicine in Rio de Janeiro. Fontes, already engaged in research on unexplained aerial phenomena, approached the case with the discipline of a clinician. His focus was not on speculation, but on symptoms, consistency of testimony, and medical plausibility. The interview process was structured. Antonio was asked to recount the events of October 1957 in chronological detail, beginning with the first observation of the red light and ending with his release into the field. Fontes noted that his account was linear, consistent, and precise, despite the 4-year interval. He did not alter details between sessions, and his memory of physical sensations, coldness of the gel, sharpness of the chin incision, weight of restraint, remained intact. Fontes recorded not only the narrative, but also the physical aftermath described by Antonio. These included episodes of nausea, persistent headaches, fatigue, lesions on the skin resembling burns, and acute sensitivity to light. The physician examined him directly, observing the lingering marks and documenting their characteristics. Though faded by 1961, Antonio's description of their original severity aligned with medical signs typical of low-level radiation exposure. Attention was given to the wound on his chin. He explained how incision had been made with an unfamiliar instrument and how blood had been extracted directly. Fontes inspected the residual scar, confirming a small but visible mark remained. He noted its appearance as inconsistent with accidental injury. In his notes, Fontes remarked on the absence of psychological disturbance. Antonio displayed no signs of hallucination, delusion, or disordered thought. His demeanor was calm, his recounting clear, and his life otherwise stable. He continued to work as a farmer, lived with his family, and maintained ordinary responsibilities. These factors supported the credibility of his testimony. Fontes concluded that the medical evidence pointed toward exposure to a source of ionizing radiation, though not at lethal levels. The combination of nausea, headaches, fatigue, skin lesions, and photophobia were consistent with such exposure. He emphasized that this pattern was difficult to attribute to environmental or occupational hazards in Antonio's rural setting. Agricultural work, while physically demanding, did not account for radiation-like symptoms. The physician documented his findings meticulously, compiling both narrative and clinical notes into a case record. This report was later shared among circles of UFO researchers and medical professionals interested in anomalous encounters. For them, it represented one of the earliest medically documented abduction cases, predating the more publicized experiences of Barney and Betty Hill in the United States. Yet outside these circles, the reception was divided. To many, the account stretched credibility, not because of inconsistency or lack of evidence, but because of the implications it carried. The combination of rural testimony, unfamiliar medical procedures, and reproductive themes challenged cultural acceptance. Skeptics dismissed it as fabrication or misinterpretation. Others ignored it entirely. Fontes, however, stood by the record. He maintained that the testimony was coherent, the symptoms genuine, and the clinical evidence consistent with exposure to a force beyond ordinary experience. His report became part of the permanent archive of abduction research, cited repeatedly in later years as an early cornerstone case. For Antonio, the act of recounting did not bring resolution. It transferred experience into documentation, preserved by another but unresolved in meaning. The evidence existed, but recognition did not follow. But even with evidence, the world wasn't ready to believe. After the interview with Dr. Olavo Fontes and the circulation of his case among researchers, Antônio Vilas-Boas returned to the life he had always known. farming in rural Minas Gerais. His daily routine resumed with the cycles of planting and harvest, and his identity remained that of a farmer, not of a public figure. He did not seek attention, nor did he attempt to build a reputation on his account. His testimony existed as documentation preserved by others, while he himself lived quietly. In his personal life, Antonio rarely spoke about the incident. Family members noted his reluctance to revisit the subject, mentioning it only when pressed, and even then with brevity. For him, the event had been endured, not celebrated. He had told the story to a physician, offered details when required, and then retreated into silence. The act of disclosure appeared to have been more obligation than relief. Despite his own restraint, the case gained traction among researchers internationally. By the early 1960s, his account had become one of the earliest formally recorded abduction reports. Importantly, it predated the widely publicized experience of Barney and Betty Hill in 1960, which introduced the concept of abduction into American culture. Where the Hill case was amplified by media and dramatization, the Vilas-Boas testimony circulated in more specialized circles, studied, translated, and debated in conferences and publications. Skeptics and believers divided quickly. For skeptics, the rural setting and extraordinary claims suggested invention, whether motivated by personal gain or misinterpretation of ordinary events. They questioned why such a phenomenon would occur in isolation, targeting a farmer with no background in aviation or science. Others pointed to the psychological burden of isolation, long hours, and fatigue as fertile ground for misperception. For supporters, however, Antonio's case stood apart because of its clinical corroboration. The symptoms he exhibited, lesions resembling radiation burns, fatigue, nausea, and sensitivity to light, were consistent with medical descriptions of exposure. The scar on his chin offered physical trace evidence of the reported procedure. Combined with the absence of contradiction in his narrative, the account gained credibility among those searching for early patterns in abduction phenomena. As the decades passed, the Vilas-Boas case became a fixture in ufological history. It was cited as a prototype for many elements that would later reappear in reports worldwide. Mechanical craft with legs, small suited figures, clinical procedures, and reproductive themes. Researchers saw it as an origin point, a precedent that shaped the vocabulary of abduction accounts. Yet for Antonio himself, none of this altered his daily life. He remained in Minas Gerais, farming his land, raising a family, and living without the visibility his testimony had earned abroad. His silence contrasted with the noise his case generated elsewhere. He did not lecture, write, or promote. He maintained privacy even as others debated the meaning of what had happened to him. The case thus carried dual lives. One was archival and public, studied in journals and cited as a foundational report. The other was private and personal, defined by silence, routine, and the return to ordinary labor. The two did not intersect beyond the record taken in 1960. In the end, the questions remained unresolved. For some, his experience reflected medical delusion or psychological projection, shaped by stress, isolation, or suggestion. For others, it stood as genuine encounter, a rare documented intrusion into human life. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive, leaving interpretation open. What endured was the silence of the man himself, and he silence of the land where the event began. Was it medical delusion, psychological projection, or genuine encounter? The silence of the fields still holds the answer, and that concludes the account of Antônio Vilas-Boas, a farmer whose night in 1957 became one of the earliest documented abduction cases. Decades later, the questions remain unresolved. Was it medical delusion, psychological projection, or a genuine encounter? The silence of the fields never answered. If this story left you thinking, don't let the conversation end here. Subscribe to Cozy Cosmic Tales. Tap the bell so you never miss the next journey into the unknown, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every perspective helps us piece together the fragments of these forgotten histories. Until next time, stay curious, stay watchful, and keep listening to the quiet places where stories hide.